Tonight, we journey into the smoky, sticky, and surprisingly dangerous world of the medieval tavern. Those legendary gathering places where ale flowed like rivers, strangers became friends or enemies, and the line between civilization and chaos was as thin as watered-down beer. But forget everything you think you know from fantasy movies and video games. The real medieval tavern was a place where survival meant more than just avoiding food poisoning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You are trudging through the muddy streets of 14th century London, your boots squelching through a mixture of horse dung, rotting vegetables, and things you'd rather not identify. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight, turning every road into a river of filth. Your stomach growls with a hunger that gnaws at your very soul, and your throat burns with a thirst that water alone cannot quench. In the distance, through the gray mist and smoke, you see it. A wooden sign creaking in the wind, painted with the crude image of a boar's head or a bunch of grapes. The warm glow of firelight spills from small windows, and the sound of laughter, shouting, and something that might generously be called singing drifts through the heavy wooden door. You have found a tavern, and whether you know it or not, you are about to enter a world that operates by its own rules, where fortunes are won and lost on the roll of dice, where a wrong word can earn you a knife between the ribs, and where the ale might be the cleanest thing you consume all day. The medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink. It was the beating heart of community life. The unofficial town hall, the stock exchange, the employment office, and the entertainment center all rolled into one smoky, chaotic, gloriously alive institution. But it was also a place where danger lurked in every shadow, where disease spread faster than gossip, and where the unwary could lose everything they owned before the night was through. Tonight, we are going to pull back the romantic veil that centuries of storytelling have draped over these establishments. We are going to explore the real taverns of medieval Europe, not the sanitized versions of Hollywood, but the genuine article in all its grimy, violent, fascinating glory. The first thing that would hit you upon entering a medieval tavern wasn't the sight or the sound, it was the smell. A complex bouquet of aromas that would assault your nostrils with the subtlety of a mailed fist. Imagine, if you will, the concentrated essence of unwashed humanity, mixed with the sour tang of spilled ale, the acrid smoke of poorly ventilated fires, and the mysterious but unmistakable odor of things that had been left to ferment in dark corners for far too long. Newcomers often found themselves coughing and wheezing, their eyes streaming tears that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the simple act of trying to breathe. To understand why the air was so thick you could almost chew it, you have to look at the architecture itself. The walls, constructed of wattle and daub, a mixture of wooden strips woven together and covered with mud, straw, and animal dung, were blackened with smoke and grease. They sweated moisture in the winter and radiated heat in the summer, creating a microclimate that was perpetually uncomfortable. Crude paintings or carvings might decorate these walls, often depicting religious scenes, royal heraldry, or more earthly pleasures, depending on the establishment's clientele and the owner's sense of propriety. But it was the ceiling that truly completed the atmospheric experience. Low, oppressive, and blackened with decades of smoke, it seemed to press down on the occupants like a physical weight. Massive wooden beams, often salvaged from ships or torn from ancient forests, supported the structure above. From these beams hung all manner of objects: dried herbs that did little to mask the prevailing odors, strings of onions and garlic, sides of bacon or ham in various stages of preservation, and sometimes the less savory remnants of customers who had failed to pay their debts or had otherwise offended the establishment's sense of justice. The lighting came primarily from the great hearth that dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that made every face look sinister, and every corner seemed to hide potential threats. Candles, when they could be afforded, provided additional illumination, but their flickering light only added to the sense of unease that permeated these establishments. The smoke from both fire and candles had nowhere to go but up, where it collected under the low ceiling before eventually finding its way out through gaps in the thatch or crude smoke holes that did little to improve the air quality. In this environment, every breath was an adventure. But the true horror, the thing that would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot, was under your feet. The floors, if they could be called that, were typically nothing more than packed earth, covered with a layer of rushes, long grasses that were supposed to absorb spills and provide some semblance of cleanliness. In theory, these rushes were changed regularly. In practice, they often remained in place for months, slowly composting into a rich ecosystem of decomposing organic matter. Erasmus, a scholar of the time, described these floors with absolute disgust, noting that while the top layer might appear fresh, the layers underneath harbored spittle, vomit, the leakage of dogs and men, spilled beer, and the remnants of fish. Walking across these floors was like traversing a spongy, unpredictable landscape. Your feet might sink into soft spots where ale had soaked through to the earth below, or crunch on the bones of long-forgotten meals. The more upscale establishments might have actual wooden floors, but even these were stained dark with years of spills and marked with the scars of countless knife fights, dice games gone wrong, and the general wear and tear of serving as the stage for humanity's baser instincts. Now, before we settle in, it is crucial to understand that not all medieval drinking establishments were created equal. Understanding the subtle but crucial differences between an inn, a tavern, and an alehouse could mean the difference between a comfortable night's rest and waking up in a ditch with your purse missing and your head ringing like a church bell. At the top of this hierarchy stood the inns, the aristocrats of the hospitality world. These establishments were primarily designed to house travelers, offering not just food and drink, but actual beds, or at least something that resembled beds more than it resembled a pile of straw. The better inns were substantial buildings, often constructed of stone rather than the more common wood and daub, with multiple stories and rooms that could accommodate merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers who had both the means and the need for overnight lodging. However, even the finest inns had their peculiarities that would shock modern sensibilities. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Travelers were routinely packed into rooms like cargo, with 10 or 12 strangers sharing not just the same space, but often the same bed. The concept of individual accommodation was reserved for the very wealthy, and even then it was more about status than comfort. The beds themselves were marvels of medieval engineering and endurance, constructed of rope or leather straps stretched across wooden frames, supporting mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or whatever organic material was available. These mattresses were rarely changed and never cleaned in any meaningful sense. They were home to entire ecosystems of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other creatures that viewed human guests as nothing more than a convenient food source. Sharing a bed with strangers was not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous. Theft was common, as was violence born of disputes over space, snoring, or the various bodily functions that humans perform during sleep. Many travelers learned to sleep with one eye open, and their most valuable possessions clutched tightly to their chests. Occupying the middle ground were the taverns. Originally, these establishments were the domain of vintners, wine merchants who sold their wares directly to the public. Wine was expensive, imported from France, Spain, or the Rhine region, and carried with it an air of sophistication that ale could never match. The wine trade was heavily regulated, and for good reason. Adulteration was common, with unscrupulous tavern keepers watering down their wine, mixing it with cheaper alternatives, or even creating entirely counterfeit versions. To combat fraud, customers had the right to inspect the wine they were purchasing. A suspicious patron could demand to be taken down to the cellar to see the actual barrel from which his wine was being drawn. This practice led to the development of elaborate cellars beneath many taverns, cool underground chambers where barrels of wine aged, and where the more discerning customers could verify the authenticity of their purchase. As taverns evolved, they began to expand their offerings beyond wine. Cider made from apples, perry from pears, and mead from honey all found their way onto tavern tables. Some establishments began offering food as well, recognizing that hungry customers were thirsty customers. Finally, at the bottom of the hospitality hierarchy were the alehouses. These humble establishments began as private homes, where the housewife brewed more ale than her family could consume. These women, known as alewives, would signal the availability of fresh ale by hanging a stick or broom, known as an ale stake, outside their door. This was a simple but effective form of medieval advertising. Ale was the lifeblood of medieval society, consumed by everyone from infants to the elderly, because it was often safer than water. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, killed many of the harmful bacteria that made untreated water dangerous to drink. A typical alewife might brew several times a week, producing ale that would last only a few days before turning sour. The quality of ale varied enormously from house to house. Some alewives took pride in their craft, while others sold swill contaminated with whatever ingredients they used to stretch their grain supplies. Despite their humble origins, alehouses were the true social centers of the neighborhood, where everyone knew everyone else, where credit might be extended to trusted customers, and where disputes were more likely to be settled with words than weapons. Yet, for all its assault on the senses, there was something undeniably alive about any of these places. The very air seemed to pulse with energy, with the raw vitality of people living life at its most basic level. This was humanity stripped of pretense, reduced to its essential elements: the need for food, drink, companionship, and the occasional release of violence. It was uncomfortable. It was dangerous. But it was never, ever boring. As your eyes adjust to the dim light and your lungs adapt to the thick air, you begin to make out the figures that populate this smoky underworld. Merchants counting coins with suspicious eyes, soldiers still wearing the mud of distant battlefields, pilgrims seeking shelter on their way to holy sites, craftsmen celebrating the completion of a difficult commission, and locals who seem to have grown from the very floorboards themselves. Each face told a story, and most of those stories were written in scars, missing teeth, and eyes that had seen too much. These were not the sanitized peasants of romantic literature, but real people living real lives in an age when survival was never guaranteed. Presiding over this chaos like a king over his court was the tavern keeper. Usually a man of substantial girth and questionable morals, his word was law within these walls. He knew every customer's name, their debts, their secrets, and their weaknesses. He was part confessor, part loan shark, and part executioner, depending on what the situation required. His wife, if he had one, was often equally formidable. wielding a wooden spoon or rolling pin with the skill of a trained warrior and the authority of a judge. This was the world you entered when you pushed through that heavy wooden door. A world where the normal rules of society were suspended, where anything could happen, and where the only certainty was uncertainty itself. It was a place that could offer you the best night of your life, or the last night of your life. Sometimes both at the same time. And as you stood there, taking in this assault on your senses, you realized that you had crossed more than just a threshold. You had entered a different realm entirely. Now that we have secured a spot on a grease-stained bench and acclimated our lungs to the smoke, we must address the most pressing need of any traveler: thirst. In the modern world, we drink to relax or to socialize. In the medieval tavern, you drank to survive. To understand the tavern, you must first understand the liquid that fueled it. In the 14th century, water was the enemy. If you were foolish enough to drink from a river, you were drinking the runoff from tanneries, the waste from slaughterhouses, and the contents of the city's chamber pots. Water didn't just taste bad, it was a loaded weapon pointed at your gut. Rivers served as highways, sewers, and dumping grounds all at once. Even rainwater collected in barrels quickly became a breeding ground for parasites. The solution was alcohol, specifically ale. The brewing process, which required boiling the water, killed most of the harmful microorganisms. This wasn't understood in scientific terms. The germ theory of disease was still centuries away, but the practical effects were obvious. People who drank ale lived. People who drank water died of dysentery. This led to a society where alcohol consumption began at birth and continued until death. Infants were fed small beer, a weak, low-alcohol version that provided hydration and calories without intoxication. Adults consumed stronger versions throughout the day, not necessarily to get drunk, but to fuel their bodies for hard labor. Ale was not just a beverage. It was liquid bread, cloudy, thick, and full of floating grain particles that provided essential nutrition. But where did this ale come from? If you were in a humble alehouse, it was likely brewed in the back room by the alewife. Brewing was traditionally women's work, a domestic skill passed down like weaving or cooking. When a fresh batch was ready, the alewife wouldn't put up a neon sign. She would thrust a long wooden pole, known as an ale stake, out of her front window, sometimes topped with a bush of evergreen. This was the universal signal that the tap was open. But the quality was a gamble. Some alewives were masters of their craft, producing rich, flavorful brews. Others were less scrupulous, selling swill that was sour, weak, or contaminated. Because ale was so vital to survival, the government regulated it fiercely. Enter the ale conner. This was an actual government official whose job was to go from house to house, testing the quality and price of the ale. Legend has it, they had a very peculiar method of testing the sugar content. The ale conner would allegedly pour a small puddle of ale onto a wooden bench and sit in it while wearing leather breeches. He would sit there for 30 minutes, drinking and talking. When he stood up, if his leather breeches didn't stick to the bench, the ale was too thin. The sugar content was too low. If he stuck fast to the wood, the ale was too sweet and under-fermented. It had to be just right. Whether this is folklore or fact, it illustrates the obsession with quality control in an era of chaos. However, if you had coins to spare and wanted to separate yourself from the peasantry, you didn't drink ale. You drank wine. Wine was the domain of the vintners, and the tavern was their showroom. Imported from France, Spain, or the Rhine, wine carried an air of sophistication. But it was also the target of rampant fraud. Unscrupulous tavern keepers were essentially the chemists of the underworld. They would water down expensive vintages, mix in vinegar, or use egg whites, alum, and even sulfur to fake the color and taste of a premium Bordeaux. A barrel of wine that left France in perfect condition might arrive in London as expensive vinegar if the journey took too long. To hide this, vintners would mix it with honey and spices, selling it as a special blend. The deception was so rampant that in London, strict laws were passed forbidding vintners from going into the cellar to draw wine out of the customer's sight. A suspicious patron had the right to demand to be taken down to the cellar to see the actual barrel. Many taverns were forced to build their cellars with open grates facing the street so the public could look down and ensure no one was mixing chemicals in the dark. The penalties for fraud were severe. A tavern keeper caught selling adulterated wine might find himself locked in the pillory, with the offending rotten liquid poured over his head. A sticky, public humiliation that could ruin a business forever. But eventually, the drink is not enough. The hunger sets in. And this is where the tavern truly tests your constitution. The centerpiece of the tavern menu was the pottage. This was a thick stew that could contain virtually anything edible, and quite a few things that weren't. In many establishments, this wasn't just a meal. It was an entity known as the perpetual stew, or the hunter's pot. The concept is terrifyingly simple. The cauldron never leaves the fire, and it never gets emptied. You eat a bowl today, and the cook throws in a few turnips to replace it. Tomorrow, maybe a rabbit. The day after, a piece of salted pork. The new ingredients mix with the old, meaning the broth at the bottom of the cauldron could be weeks or even months old. It was a microbiological roulette wheel. Was the meat fresh? Maybe. But tavern keepers were not above buying reject meat from butchers, cuts from animals that had died of disease rather than slaughter, or meat that had started to turn green. The heavy salting and long boiling time were the only things standing between you and a slow, painful death. Spices like pepper, ginger, and cloves, if the tavern could afford them, were not used for gourmet flavor profiles. They were used to mask the stench of decay. If a tavern dish was heavily spiced, the wise traveler knew to be very, very worried. And do not expect a plate. You would likely be eating off a trencher, a slab of stale, coarse bread that had been left out for days to harden. It acted as your edible bowl, absorbing the grease and juices of the stew. If you were starving, you ate the trencher at the end of the meal. If you were wealthy, you left the soggy, gravy-soaked bread for the dogs fighting under the table, or for the beggars waiting at the door. The bread itself told a story of class. The rich ate manchet, fine white wheat bread. The tavern regulars ate horse bread, a dense, dark loaf made from beans, peas, and oats, gritty enough to wear your teeth down to nubs over a lifetime. Cheese was another staple, ranging from fresh, soft varieties to hard cheeses aged so long they could be used as doorstops. But again, safety was an illusion. Cheese made from the milk of sick cows could transmit diseases like tuberculosis. Eggs, when available, were a welcome addition. But without refrigeration, cracking an egg was always a gamble. One bad egg could ruin the entire perpetual stew, filling the tavern with a sulfurous stench that would linger for days. The preparation of this food was a communal nightmare. In the cramped tavern kitchen, raw meat might be chopped on the same surface as the bread. Vegetables washed in the same water used to scrub the floor. Cross-contamination wasn't an accident. It was the standard operating procedure. And yet, for the medieval peasant, this was often the best meal they would get all week. A hot bowl of pottage, no matter how questionable the meat, provided the calories needed to survive another day of back-breaking labor. The tavern keeper knew this. He knew that as long as the ale was strong enough to dull the senses and the stew was hot enough to fill the belly, the customers would keep coming back. So there you sit, teeth aching from the gritty bread, stomach churning from the dubious meat, and your mind slowly becoming foggy from the lead-laced wine. You are now fully fueled. The basic needs of survival have been met. But as the candles burn lower and the shadows lengthen, the atmosphere in the tavern begins to shift. The focus moves from sustenance to vice. The wooden bowls are pushed aside, and the gaming boards come out. You are about to witness the true engine of the tavern economy, where money changes hands faster than the plague, and where a game of dice is often the prelude to a funeral. As the ale takes hold, and the room fills with the haze of smoke and sweat, the tavern transforms. It ceases to be merely a place to eat and drink, and becomes a theater of humanity. If you want to understand the medieval world, you don't go to a castle, and you certainly don't go to a church. You come here. The tavern was the great equalizer, the only place where the rigid social hierarchy of the Middle Ages dissolved into a muddy, drunken blur. A merchant might share a bench with a craftsman, a soldier might drink with a priest, and a nobleman might find himself gambling with a thief. But do not mistake this for a friendly community gathering. It was a powder keg of conflicting interests, desperate needs, and volatile personalities. Look around the room. The cast of characters here would make a modern crime novelist weep with envy. Over in the corner, you see the merchants. They are the most visible patrons, dressed in fine wool, sporting jewelry that proclaims their wealth. They are natural storytellers, regaling the room with tales of distant markets and exotic goods. But look closer at their eyes. They are terrified. A successful merchant in a tavern is like a walking advertisement for robbery. They sit with their backs to the wall, constantly calculating profit and loss, knowing that every friendly stranger could be a cutpurse waiting for them to black out. They travel in groups for protection, hiring guards who are often just as dangerous as the bandits they are supposed to repel. Near the fire, dominating the best seats, are the soldiers. These aren't the chivalrous knights of King Arthur's court. These are mercenaries, veterans of the 100 Years' War or local skirmishes. They wear their hardships like badges of honor. Their armor is battered, their weapons stained. They suffer from what we would now call PTSD, though back then it was just called life. They are disciplined professionals when sober, but when the drink loosens their tongues, old grievances surface. A soldier is trained to kill, and in the cramped confines of a tavern, he is a weapon that can go off at the slightest provocation. They are the enforcers, the bouncers, and often the instigators of the night's chaos. Then there are the pilgrims. You might think the holy travelers would be the safest company, but the tavern reveals the dark side of piety. Many are genuine seekers of spiritual enlightenment, but others are using pilgrimage as an elaborate excuse for an adventure, a way to escape debts, unhappy marriages, or the law. Among them, you will find the pardoners and false relic sellers. These are the con artists of the spiritual world. That man holding up a small, yellowed bone and claiming it is the finger of a saint? It is likely a chicken bone he found in the alley. That vial of holy water? Ditch water. They prey on the superstitions of the drunken crowd, selling salvation for a copper coin. Perhaps most surprisingly, you will find the clergy. Despite the church officially condemning taverns as dens of iniquity, parish priests, traveling monks, and minor church officials are regulars. Some are there because they have nowhere else to eat. Others are there because they are as corrupt as the people they preach to. The corrupt clergyman was a stock character in medieval literature for a reason. He was real. These men have education and moral authority, which they often use to manipulate the crowd, selling false indulgences or performing illegal marriages in the back room for a fee. And weaving through them all are the thieves, the cut purses. The most dangerous thieves aren't the ones looking like criminals. They are the ones who look like you. They are the upright men, the leaders of criminal gangs who dress like honest merchants to gain your trust. They work in teams. One will bump into you or spill a drink to create a distraction, while another slices the strings of your purse with a razor-sharp knife. By the time you realize your money is gone, they have already bought a round of drinks for the house with your gold. As the night wears on, the conversation dies down, replaced by a rhythmic, percussive sound. Clack, clack, thud. The gaming boards have come out. In the flickering candlelight, fortunes are about to be won and lost. Gambling wasn't just a pastime in the Middle Ages. It was an obsession. In a world where your fate was decided by plague, famine, and the whims of lords, gambling was a way to look destiny in the eye and dare it to blink. It was an attempt to force luck in a luckless world. The game of choice was dice. Specifically, a game called hazard, the complex and ruthless ancestor of modern craps. It sounds simple: 2 dice, a main number, a chance to win or lose. But the betting possibilities were endless. Side wagers on individual throws, sequences, and even whether the next die would drop off the table, creating a complex web of financial obligations that could bankrupt a man in minutes. But here is the secret. The game was rarely fair. If you see a man winning consistently, he isn't lucky. He is a dicer, a professional cheat. The tools of his trade are works of dark art. He carries loaded dice, weighted on one side with quicksilver or lead to favor a specific number. He uses bristled dice, which have a tiny, invisible hog's hair sticking out of one side to prevent the die from landing on that face. And the most insidious of all, the high men and low men. These dice are not cubes. They are shaped ever so slightly off square, barely perceptible to the eye, but enough to ensure they roll only high or low numbers. The skilled dicer uses sleight of hand, known as palming, to swap the fair dice for the loaded ones just before a crucial throw. He relies on the dim light, the smoke, and the drunkenness of his victims to hide his deception. He isn't playing against luck. He is engineering your ruin. And it wasn't just dice. Cards were beginning to infiltrate the taverns, bringing with them new games like Primero, an ancestor of poker. But cards were easily marked, bent, or shaved to give the dealer an advantage. For those who preferred their gambling with a side of blood, there were the animal sports. Cockfighting was rampant. In the yard behind the tavern, or sometimes right in the middle of the floor, roosters with sharpened metal spurs would tear each other apart, while men screamed bets on the survivor. It was brutal, messy, and loud, a perfect reflection of the tavern itself. Gambling debts were a special kind of dangerous. They were debts of honor, not legally enforceable in court, which meant they were enforced by violence. A man who lost his wages at the dice table might try to steal them back. A man who accused another of cheating was issuing a challenge that could only be answered with steel. The tension in the room rises with every roll of the dice. The laughter fades. The hands that were holding mugs are now resting near the hilts of knives. The tavern has shifted from a place of social gathering to a predatory arena. You can feel it in the air, the shift from camaraderie to hostility. The alcohol has done its work. The inhibitions are gone. The money is on the table. and someone is about to make a move that will turn this night from a party into a crime scene. The snap of tension is audible. When the cheating is exposed or a debt is refused, the tavern ceases to be a business and becomes a battlefield. We have a romanticized view of medieval brawls. A bit of pushing, maybe a punch thrown, and then everyone laughs it off. The reality was horrifyingly different. Violence in a medieval tavern was sudden, brutal, and often fatal. You have to remember that in this era, personal honor was a currency more valuable than gold. A perceived slight, an insult to one's wife, or an accusation of lying wasn't something you could ignore. To back down was to lose your social standing entirely. Furthermore, almost everyone in the room is armed. Not with swords, those were for the nobility or the battlefield, but with knives. Every man and woman carried a knife for eating and utility. When tempers flared, those knives came out. A forensic analysis of medieval skeletons often reveals a shocking number of healed and unhealed cranial fractures and knife wounds consistent with tavern brawls. But the knife wasn't the only weapon. The heavy pewter or wooden tankard you're drinking from? That is a bludgeon. A solid blow to the temple with a heavy ale mug could crush a skull. In the close, crowded quarters of the tavern, there was no room for fencing or technique. It was a messy, grappling struggle, gouging eyes, biting ears, and stabbing blindly in the smoke. The aftermath of this violence was even more terrifying than the fight itself, because of the state of medieval medicine. If you survived the stab wound, you faced the infection. There were no antibiotics. A dirty knife, covered in the bacteria of the tavern floor in the previous meal, would introduce pathogens deep into the body. A flesh wound in a medieval tavern was often a slow death sentence, leading to gangrene, fever, and sepsis. The tavern keeper might pour some wine on it, or cauterize it with a hot poker from the fire, but often the survivor of the fight would simply be dead a week later. Yet, amidst this violence and thievery, there was another trade plying its wares in the shadows and upstairs rooms. The tavern was the epicenter of the medieval sex trade. The women who worked here, often referred to euphemistically in records as single women, or more derogatorily as Winchester geese in London, lived lives of incredible hardship. The term Winchester geese is a grim historical irony. The brothels of Southwark were located on land owned by the Bishop of Winchester. The church officially condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, preaching fire and brimstone from the pulpit. But practically, they profited from it. St. Augustine himself famously compared prostitution to a sewer in a palace, arguing that if you take away the sewer, you fill the palace with pollution. This hypocrisy meant that the tavern brothel often operated with the tacit approval of religious institutions that collected the rent. For the women, however, there was no romance in this life. They were vulnerable to the whims of violent men, constantly at risk of disease and socially ostracized. They were the lowest of the low, yet they were essential to the tavern's economy. They served the drinks, they cleaned the filth, and they provided companionship to the lonely, the displaced, and the drunk. Their survival depended on a razor-thin balance of wit and toughness. A successful tavern worker knew how to handle a knife just as well as she knew how to handle a customer. As the night deepens and the chaos reaches its peak, you might wonder, where is the law? Where are the police? The answer is, you are looking at them. The medieval system of law enforcement was patchwork at best and non-existent at worst. There was no police force in the modern sense. In the tavern keeper was the judge, jury, and executioner. His word was law because it had to be. If he couldn't control his establishment, he would lose his license or his life. Outside, You might have the watch, groups of citizens forced to patrol the streets at night. But they were often unpaid, untrained, and just as likely to be drunk in the tavern themselves. If a serious crime was committed, the victim was expected to raise the hue and cry, literally shouting for neighbors to come and help catch the criminal. But in a tavern brawl involving drunk soldiers and armed merchants, most people would look the other way. Justice, when it did arrive, was arbitrary and cruel. If the authorities raided the tavern, they weren't reading anyone their rights. They were dragging people to the jail, a place often more dangerous than the tavern itself, where you would rot until you could pay a fine or face a magistrate. For the poor, the punishment for tavern crimes, theft, disorder, fighting, was swift and physical. The stocks, the pillory, or the whip. Eventually, the fire burns down to embers. The shouting fades into a stupor of exhausted intoxication. Bodies are strewn across the floor, sleeping on the filthy rushes amidst the food scraps and the rats. Dawn breaks over the medieval city, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. The tavern door swings open, letting in the cool morning air to mix with the stale stench of the night before. The survivors stumble out into the light, squinting, checking their purses, and nursing their wounds. The morning after is when the true cost of tavern life becomes apparent. Bodies had to be removed, some merely unconscious from drink, others permanently silenced by violence. Debts had to be collected. Reputations had to be rebuilt or abandoned. For the tavern keeper, the cycle simply resets. He sweeps the floor, turning over the rushes to hide the bloodstains. He refills the perpetual stew with fresh water and maybe a stray vegetable. He checks the barrels in the cellar, and he prepares for the next night. The medieval tavern was a filthy, dangerous, and often lethal place. It was a sensory nightmare of bad smells, worse food, and toxic drink. It was a den of thieves, a casino of fraud, and a theater of violence. But it was also the most profoundly human place in the medieval world. It was the only space where people could escape the crushing weight of their reality. Inside these wattle and daub walls, life burned bright and hot. It was a place where a peasant could feel like a king for an hour, where a stranger could become a brother, and where hope, however irrational, was sold by the pint. So, the next time you watch a fantasy movie and see the heroes laughing in a clean, well-lit tavern, you will know the truth. You will know about the smell. You will know about the floor. And you will know that the real adventure wasn't fighting the dragon outside. It was surviving the dinner inside. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark history of hospitality. If you survived this video, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, because in our next episode, we are going even darker. Until then, stay safe and watch what you drink. If the taste of the tavern was sour ale, and the smell was rotting rushes, then the sound of the tavern was a cacophony that would drive a modern person to madness. We tend to imagine a lone bard strumming a lute and singing a gentle ballad about a dragon. This is another fantasy. The entertainment in a medieval tavern was loud, rude, and often aggressive. It had to be heard over the shouting of drunks, the barking of dogs, and the clatter of dice. The musicians who frequented these places were not courtly troubadours. They were wandering minstrels, a class of people often considered little better than beggars or thieves. The instruments they played were designed for volume, not subtlety. The bagpipes were a favorite, their piercing drone capable of cutting through the thickest noise. The hurdy-gurdy, a mechanical violin with a crank that produced a relentless, grinding rhythm, was another staple. And then there were the drums, beating out a pulse that drove the drinking and the dancing to fever pitches. The songs they sang were not polite. They were bawdy, satirical, and deeply political. In an age before newspapers, the minstrel was the news anchor. They sang songs mocking the local bishop's greed, the king's latest tax failure, or the sexual escapades of the neighboring village's miller. These songs served a vital social function, allowing the oppressed peasantry to laugh at their masters in the safety of the tavern's shadows. But music was just one form of entertainment. If you were lucky, or perhaps unlucky, a traveling troupe might stop by. These performers brought the bizarre and the grotesque right to your table. You might see a gleeman juggling knives while balancing on a stool, or a bearward dragging a muzzled dancing bear on a chain, a terrified animal that was often as dangerous to the audience as it was to its handler. Acrobats, fire eaters, and storytellers vied for your attention and your coins. The tavern was the medieval equivalent of YouTube, Netflix, and the circus, all crammed into a room the size of a garage. However, beneath the noise and the laughter, there was a layer of deep-seated superstition. The medieval world was a terrifying place, filled not just with physical dangers, but with spiritual ones. The night was not just dark, it was the domain of demons, witches, and the restless dead. The tavern, with its light and noise, was a fortress against these terrors, but it was also a place where superstition ran rampant. Look closely at the architecture again. You might see strange marks carved into the wooden beams or above the fireplace. These are witch marks, or apotropaic symbols, geometric designs meant to trap evil spirits or prevent witches from entering the building. The ale itself was often the subject of magical thinking. If a batch of ale went sour, it wasn't blamed on bacteria, it was blamed on a witch's curse. Alewives would often bury a bottle of ale under the threshold, or hang a hagstone, a stone with a naturally occurring hole, over the fermentation barrels to ward off the evil eye. The stories told around the tavern fire were not just for entertainment, they were warnings. Travelers would share whispered tales of the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of hunters that rode across the sky stealing souls. They spoke of black dogs, spectral hounds that haunted the crossroads, presaging death. In the flickering light of the hearth, these stories felt terrifyingly real. A sudden draft that blew out a candle wasn't just wind, it was a spirit passing through. A cat staring at an empty corner was seeing something human eyes could not. The tavern was a place where the barrier between the natural and the supernatural felt incredibly thin. This atmosphere of dread brings us to the reason why you are in the tavern in the first place. It is not just because you wanted a drink. It is because being outside after dark was a death sentence. To understand the sanctuary of the tavern, you must understand the horror of the road. Medieval travel was an ordeal that modern humans can scarcely comprehend. The King's Highway was often nothing more than a muddy track through dense, ancient forests. There were no streetlights, no road signs, and no GPS. If you were caught on the road after sunset, you were in the domain of the wolf and the outlaw. The tavern was, therefore, a strategic necessity. They were spaced out along major routes, roughly one day's travel apart. When you saw that light in the distance, it wasn't just a sign of comfort. It was a sign that you had survived another day. But the road brought the outside world into the tavern in ways that were both exciting and dangerous. It brought news of wars, of plagues in distant cities, and of rebellions. In fact, the tavern was the engine room of revolution. Because it was a space where the lower classes gathered without the direct supervision of their lords, it was where sedition was brewed alongside the ale. The Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which saw London burn and the Archbishop of Canterbury beheaded, was planned in the back rooms of taverns just like this one. It was here that whispered complaints turned into shouted slogans, and where angry farmers became a revolutionary army. The tavern keeper knew this, of course. He knew that hosting such talk was treason, punishable by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. But he also knew that revolutionaries drank a lot of ale. It was a calculated risk, balancing the profits of sedition against the risk of the executioner's block. And let's not forget the spies. In every busy tavern, amidst the drunks and the gamblers, there were ears listening. The king's spies, the bishop's informants, or just a local snitch looking for a reward. A loose tongue in a tavern could lead to an arrest the next morning. That merchant you were talking to? The one who asks so many questions about your opinion on the new tax. He might be writing your name on a list right now. The tavern was a place of freedom, yes, but it was a freedom monitored by paranoia. You were free to be yourself as long as you didn't say the wrong thing to the wrong person. So, we have the noise, the superstition, the danger of the road, and the shadow of politics. The tavern is now fully fleshed out. It is a sensory overload, a spiritual fortress, a revolutionary cell, and a trap for the unwary. But all nights must end. And as the final hours approach, we must look at the legacy of this place. What did it leave behind? And why, despite the filth and the danger, do we still romanticize it today? As the dawn approaches, the character of the tavern changes one last time. The musicians have passed out in the corner. The fire has burned down to glowing embers, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. The shouting has subsided into a low, rhythmic snoring, punctuated by the occasional cough of a smoker's lung. The floor is now a battlefield of debris, broken pottery, gnawed bones, and bodies. This is the sleep of the just, or perhaps the sleep of the just barely alive. In this quiet moment, before the sun rises and the cycle of work begins again, we can see the medieval tavern for what it truly was. It was not merely a business. It was the living room of the human race. In a world where privacy was non-existent, where peasants lived in one-room huts with their animals and nobles slept in dormitories, the tavern offered a different kind of public privacy. It was a place where you could be anonymous in a crowd. It was a place to escape the crushing expectations of family, church, and lord. The legacy of these establishments is written into our very language and culture. The pub, or public house, the bar, the inn, these are direct descendants of the medieval tavern. The custom of toasting comes from this era, where a piece of spiced toast was literally dropped into a jug of wine or ale to soak up the sediment and improve the flavor. The person who drank last got the toast. Hence the phrase, the toast of the town. The signs that hang outside modern British pubs, the Red Lion, the King's Head, the White Hart, are fossils of medieval heraldry, visual codes that once told illiterate peasants who owned the land or what political allegiance the landlord held. But the deeper legacy is psychological. The medieval tavern taught us how to be social in an urban environment. It taught us how to navigate the complex waters of dealing with strangers, how to assess risk, how to negotiate, and how to find common ground over a shared drink. It was the crucible in which the modern concept of public opinion was forged. Before there were newspapers or parliaments, there was the tavern bench. It was here that the common people realized they had a voice, even if it was a slurred one. We look back at the filth, the disease, and the violence with horror, and rightfully so. We are fortunate to live in an age of health inspectors, refrigeration, and antibiotics. We are lucky that our pottage doesn't have a 3-month-old rabbit foot in it. But we must also recognize what we have lost. The medieval tavern had a raw, unpolished vitality that is missing from our sanitized, fluorescent-lit world. It was a place of extreme contrasts, life and death, joy and terror, feast and famine, all happening within four walls. It was a place where human connection wasn't mediated by screens or algorithms, but by physical proximity. You smelled your neighbor. You heard their heartbeat. You shared their bacteria. It was a connection of blood and bone. The danger of the tavern forced a kind of authentic trust. When you drank with a man in the 14th century, you were trusting him not to stab you, and he was trusting you not to rob him. That precarious truce is the foundation of civilization. So, as the sun finally breaks over the horizon, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air, the tavern keeper begins to stir. He kicks the rushes, waking the sleepers. He throws a bucket of water over the worst of the filth. He unbars the door. The magic is broken. The fortress of the night becomes just a dirty room in the cold light of day. The patrons stumble out, blinking, back to their fields, their workshops, and their harsh lives. They are poorer, they are hungrier, and they are hungover. But they have survived. And tonight, they will be back. Because the tavern offers something that the church and the castle cannot. It offers acceptance. It accepts your money, your stories, your sins, and your thirst without judgment. It is the ultimate human institution. Thank you for taking this long, dark journey with me. We have walked through the mud, eaten the perpetual stew, dodged the loaded dice, and survived the brawl. We have seen the Middle Ages not as a fairy tale, but as a gritty, sensory reality. If you have enjoyed this deep dive, if you have learned something new, or if you are just grateful for your refrigerator and your clean water, please leave a like. It helps the channel more than you know. Subscribe for more dark history, more deep dives, and more truth. Until next time, keep your powder dry, check your wine for vinegar, and watch your back in the dark. Cheers.